Good morning. We're going to get started. I feel really far away from all of you today. The setup's a little bit different. Nothing personal. I'm not sick as far as I know or anything like that. But welcome to another session of The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. And today in front of us is the book of 2 Samuel, which comes right after 1 Samuel. One book split in half to make it a little bit more manageable. And we'll jump right in with the first thing in every church service, the announcements. Joel Baden, who we also interviewed on 1 Samuel, we have a new interview with him on 2 Samuel, which is on the website. If you go to the Westminster website, click on Grow Adult Education. At the very top, there's a paragraph. Click on the Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny. It should be on the right-hand margin. Wednesday, we are doing something special at Westminster, always something special at Westminster, but we're hosting a lecture that's being put on by the University of Minnesota's Center for Jewish Studies, and it's Professor Leora Batnitsky, who is, I believe, chair of the religion department at Princeton University, and she is going to be lecturing on Edith Stein and her relevance for Christian-Jewish dialogue. Edith Stein was a Jewish philosopher who converted to Roman Catholicism, I think in the 1930s, and he's eventually killed in a Nazi death camp because she's Jewish, was later beatified or made a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, and was a lightning rod, maybe still is in some settings in Jewish, especially Roman Catholic relations, and so we're going to have, hopefully let people hear, this is all free, Westminster Hall, 7:30 on Wednesday. You're welcome to join that. I believe that is not going to be live streamed. It's not our program, so
they will record it and show it later, but we're not live streaming it.
Yeah, it will be recorded, shown later, I think through the U of M Center of Jewish
That's right.
Studies. And so as a result, we will not have a Wednesday evening discussion on 2 Samuel this week. Great disappointment, filled the room. Nor will we have a Wednesday conversation on the 22nd, because that's the day before Thanksgiving. So save up all of your questions and comments for November 29th when we're back together on a Wednesday, or reach out to me and Margaret if it's something more pressing. So that's all by way of introduction. To jump into the story of 2 Samuel, which is the story of David, at least of a more adult David compared to what we see in 1 Samuel. That doesn't mean more mature, it just means older. I want to recall... that's the theme of today. I want to recall a couple of passages we've seen already. Way back in Genesis chapter 12, when Abram and his wife Sarai are first called to go into Canaan and are first introduced to this strange God, the Lord says this, God says this to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation." That idea, I will make of you a great nation, is one of these themes that keeps recurring from Genesis up to where we are now in the story. "And I will make your name great, and so that you will be a blessing." Right? The purpose of this choice of Abram and Abram's people and the nation that would come from them is that they would be a source of blessing to the wider world. "I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is a passage that gets picked up in the Newer Testament from time to time as well, seeing Jesus as a kind of fulfillment of this. And Jews today will still talk about what does it mean to be Jewish so that they might be a source of blessing to the wider world. This is the ideal. This is what's there from the beginning of the story. Welcome to folks just arriving. We've got some seats, especially on my right, your left. I didn't say hi to the live stream people, but hello. Glad you're with us. Even into Exodus now, many, many years after that, and after the crossing of the Red Sea, God says this to Moses, "If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me," this is God speaking, "a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." So again, the vision that we saw in the first 5 books in Torah has been for a nation that will be unlike the other nations, nations in which everybody is priestly in the sense that everybody is participating in God's holiness. Everybody is living a kind of life in which all are blessed. And there's a lot we can say about the law. and the various commandments in there, but one of the key themes that runs through this is justice. It's about equity, it's about the poor and travelers and strangers being taken care of. So there's this image of a just nation, of a beautiful nation. And as we talked about, that starts to deteriorate, or at least once real life starts to be lived, we recognize just how hard it is for a nation to live up to its ideals. Maybe that sounds familiar to us as Americans in a variety of ways, which we could get into ad nauseum. But it's this tension between what are our ideals, what is a nation's ideals, or a people's ideals, or a religion's ideals, and the real life stuff that gets lived out. Which takes us to David. And Margaret introduced David last week, the young David, and talked a lot about the ambivalence of how he's presented, the way in which David seems really saintly in some moments, and then you flip a page and he seems quite vile at other moments. And that's not just our imagination, that's not our modern sensibilities. There's a way in which I think the book tries to present him as a very complicated figure for probably a host of reasons. Joel Baden talks about how there might have been different traditions or memories about David that are woven into 1st and 2nd Samuel. And not to prejudice what we're doing too much, but there is almost this kind of polarity. At times, David seems like, this ideal president. Most of us in this room remember the West Wing. This is what got me through a certain period of U.S. history. Imagining, what if our country really was run by the best of the best, right? People who were trying really, really hard and had their flaws, for sure, but you saw their character and you thought, I like these people. I'm glad they have power. Is David a Jed Bartlett kind of a figure, or is David more Tony Soprano? Again, some of us might have watched The Sopranos. Is he more of a mob boss at times? Does he know how to use power and coercion to get what he wants? Does he know how to pay back his enemies in particularly ruthless ways? Joel Baden says this in the video. He says, there are numerous people who have a stake in David's story, which is a great way of putting it, right? This says numerous people have a stake in any nation's or any religion's reputation or history and how our stories get told. So one of the things, if you find yourself reading through 2 Samuel, it's very difficult to kind of discern, does the narrative realize just how awful this person is from time to time? Or is the narrative trying to cover up or kind of trying to whitewash this person? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, or if David is a new character to you, I just want to say that there's a lot of difficult subject matter in this book, which we should just name. There are several chapters, several incidences of sexual violence in 2 Samuel. There are stories about the death of children. There are stories of murders and assassinations. I just put that out there. Some of you, if we have opportunities to share with each other, might not be in the mood to discuss any of this today, and that's absolutely fine. No one needs to discuss anything. But I want to point out the subject matter being difficult. I don't want to say too much more because I also want to start. Margaret last week asked, basically, what do you know about David? What stories do you remember about David? And I wasn't able to be here last week, but I watched on video, and pretty much everything shared, I think, came from 1 Samuel, with the exception of the story about David and Bathsheba and Uriah, which is a 2 Samuel story, which we will get to. But are there any other stories anybody remembers about David? And if you make a mistake and it's 1 Samuel, don't worry about it. But we talked last week about Goliath. We talked about David being a shepherd boy who's chosen by the prophet Samuel. We talked about David having opportunities to kill Saul. Saul is dead when 2 Samuel begins. When I say this is about the adult David, so to speak, or this is David as he comes into his kingship. Does anybody remember a story? We can just shout it out, and I'll repeat it for the people online. David and Absalom. Okay, Absalom is one of his sons, and there's going to be a civil war, just to spoil where we're going, but there'll be a civil war between David's forces and Absalom's forces. Anybody else? We don't know a lot of the stories in this book. And by we, I don't mean you. I mean like the church at whole. These are not stories that are comfortable stories and not often told stories, with probably the exception of David and Bathsheba, which has sometimes been moralized as like, oops, but it's, I think, a much more serious story than that, for sure. right? We have done so much to tame that story or to somehow make it romantic in Hollywood. So we'll come back to that as well. Anybody remember anything else about David, the adult David? All right, that's why you're here. Good. That was kind of by design, right? There's a lot in this story that's different. A lot of it is a story about military policy and planning and strategy and battles as well. So what makes this book difficult? I mentioned the subject matter already. It's just, there's a lot of really uncomfortable stories, the stories that make David look quite vile and the people around him as well. So that's one thing to name. The second thing to name is just this whole, is he a saint or is he a sinner? 1 Samuel describes him as a man after God's own heart. Does that then excuse everything else that happens in this story? I described him as being like Tony Soprano. I mean, when we see him orchestrating assassinations and things like that, are we supposed to say, well, that's what you got to do when you're king? Or are there ways in which we're supposed to see something happening? Is there a kind of moral degeneration taking place as we read this story, as we watch David use, abuse, and kind of spread the misuse of power to those in his orbit? So we kind of will keep going back and forth between, I think, this question of how are we supposed to assess this man? The other thing that makes this a difficult story, and this came up in some ways on Wednesday night, this last Wednesday in our discussion with some folks, is God is not really much of an active agent in this story. God speaks through a prophet named Nathan, but we really wish Nathan had more access to David. Maybe Nathan could have stopped some things. Nathan doesn't have a lot of visibility in this story, and so nobody really speaks for God in this story. God doesn't speak out of a cloud. God is kind of this implied presence, perhaps, who watches over things. But with the exception of some notable chapters, which we'll look at in a bit, David's story mostly proceeds, and we're left to wonder, what does God think about all of this? Or what could David possibly be teaching us about who God is? And so that makes the story a little bit different from a lot of what we've seen so far. Not to say that every time God speaks, it's comforting in some of the books that we've looked at. But it's a story it's a narrative that puts a story in front of us and kind of says, well, what do you think about that? And that's what makes it difficult, especially if we like looking to the Bible and thinking, what does God want us to do? Who is God? What does good behavior look like? What are the consequences of bad behavior? Which takes us to one of the last points on this. But before we get to that last point, I wanted to say, as we talk about this story, as I summarize it, and as we look at some individual passages, watch for the way it's a story about the pervasiveness of humanity's sin, as if we needed more reminders of that, but watch about the ways in which it shows a powerful person falling victim to sin, and look at who pays a price for that. David's missteps are about more than just his own character flaws, but people suffer as a result. So pay attention to how the story might be talking about that. And I wonder if it's also a story about the persistence of God's own faithfulness. Is the way in which David is supposedly this God-chosen king, is that God's validation of David's behavior, or is it God's validation, or is it a validation of God's commitment to the nation as a whole? Do you see the point there? Like, how are we supposed to understand God remaining faithful to this person, but also to this nation and to these people? The last thing that makes the book difficult is the question of, what do we do with all of the bad things that happen to apparently innocent people in a book like this? Is it a question about punishment coming from God, or is it a question about the consequences of our sin? And what do I mean by that distinction there? We'll read about things. Well, this is when David's sin concerning Bathsheba and her husband Uriah is found out. Nathan says, the child that's going to be born will die. God says that. Is that God's punishment of David's sin? God will also say the sword will never depart from your house. In other words, you're going to have violence within your own family for the rest of your life. Is that God saying, this is how I'm going to punish you and make you remember, all the bad things you've done? Or is this rather a sense of consequences of sin? We sometimes have this image. Remember the Far Side? This is an old Far Side cartoon. I don't know if you can see the keyboard there, but it says God at his. That's God at his computer, and there's a button there that says smite, right? So this is like It's just how we imagine God, who's just waiting to figure out, who am I going to smite today? So when God announces things, or when prophets announce things in 2 Samuel toward David and his family, is this God saying, I'm going to punish innocent people because you sin? If so, that's a very disturbing view of God. It's a view of God that I don't think holds up well when compared to the rest of the biblical witness about who God is. But it's in our imagination, isn't it? Not just because of the far side, but we sometimes imagine a vindictive God like this. Or when God announces trouble that sticks to David and David's family, is it more about, and I'm not a psychologist, so some of you are, so I'm going to hold this loosely. Is this more a story about family systems, right? Is this more about a way in which families hold on to their sin? I Googled creepy family photos, and this is what came up. Is this a story, and it's funny, but of course it's not funny when we think about family systems, right? And some of you know this all too well and firsthand, right? Families have a way of holding on to generational sin. The way that abuse sometimes gets passed down into family generations, or abusers are often people who were abused themselves. The way in which substance abuse is sometimes woven into families, the way in which domestic violence is sometimes, not always, but sometimes endemic to a family and a family system. Is this a way in which 2 Samuel is trying to acknowledge that, right? That sometimes we just get stuck and repeat the same mistakes or the same violence over and over and over again. Does that make sense? Excuse me. You see the distinction there? Thank you. You see the distinction between what I'm getting at, right? Are we reading this as punishment, or are we talking about consequences of sin? And at the end of the day, the book is not entirely clear. But if you read this and you think, I'm not so sure I like the image of this God who likes to punish people, or at least punish David, you're in good company, right? That's one of the disturbing parts of the book. And we need the rest of the Bible to help norm this, or to maybe criticize this in terms of what's going on. And this is where the prophets will become really interesting. 2 weeks from now, we'll start with the prophets, and the perspective of this series will really shift when we start looking at Isaiah and Jeremiah and Amos and and Ezekiel and some other prophetic writers who are in many ways answering back to this story of kings who are faithless, or kings who are abusive, or a nation that neglects its most vulnerable. So hold on. This is not all the Bible has to say about this kind of behavior, right? Questions or comments? Have I lost anybody, I guess is my point in terms of what's on the table. You're all really excited to be here now. You're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen in this awful story? I'm going to walk through it rather rapidly, and then we'll come back and we'll settle in on some individual passages. As 2 Samuel begins, quick water break. As 2 Samuel begins, David receives news that Saul and one of Saul's sons, Jonathan, have been killed in battle. And David and Saul have had this weird on-again, off-again relationship. David knows he's going to be king after Saul. But David is deeply grieved for the loss of both of them. Jonathan he refers to as somebody who was wonderful, and whose love for him, Jonathan's love for David, was passing the love of women. There are numerous statements in 1 and 2 Samuel about just how intimate this relationship between David and Jonathan was, which has led some to wonder about I was going to say their sexual orientation. That's kind of an anachronistic phrase in some ways for 2 Samuel, but perhaps they were lovers as well as friends. No, I'm trying to figure out where to put the water, but I got it. That's for another class probably, but just to note just how important they were to him. Chapter 2, the tribe of Judah anoints David as king in a city called Hebron, and David is left to battle Saul's remaining son, whose name is Ishbaal. David is ruling in Hebron for 7.5 years, and during that time, a man named Abner, who was the commander of Saul's army, convinces Ishbaal, one of Saul's sons, to become king, and Abner kind of convinces the rest of Israel to let Abner rule as king. And eventually a battle breaks out between Abner's forces and David's armies. David's armies are led by a man named Joab, who we'll return to frequently. Where this is, I know, impossible to read from where you are. This map's also on our website. This is the kingdom of Israel during the reign of David. It's about as large and about as secure as ancient Israel was. David was frequently successful in his military campaigns. Hebron is there at the bottom, underlined in red, and you can see Jerusalem just above that, just to kind of get a sense of where we are. And what happens during this time, 2 Samuel skims over it quite quickly. There was a long war between the house of Saul, again, Saul is dead, this is his son Ishbaal, and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. And then we're told that sons were born to David at Hebron, and there's this huge, long list of names there. The Bible tells us of, this is in my notes somewhere, of how many wives David has. Here we go. He has at least 8 wives, 8 that we know of, plus numerous concubines, probably enslaved women that were his. We know of at least 21 sons who were born to David. We assume there are many daughters, but only one, Tamar, is named. So last week when Margaret walked us through where the people say to the prophet Samuel, we want a king to rule over us just like the other nations, right? David is becoming that kind of a king who basically takes whatever he wants, builds a family to kind of secure, underline his court and his reign. When we get to chapter 3, Abner has a disagreement with Ishbaal, Saul's son, concerning a concubine and who gets to have her. And Abner, as a result, turns to David, and he goes to David and he goes to Hebron and he says, I can rally the rest of Israel to support you at king if you would like that. And 3 times the text says, David let Abner leave in peace. David let Abner leave in peace. And Abner leaves, and then Joab finds him, and Joab assassinates him. So, because Joab is convinced that Abner is not acting in good faith, that this is all just a ruse that's being set up. And the text reminds us one more time that David didn't know anything about it. In fact, the story ends. The king had no part in the killing of Abner. In other words, like 5 times it says, just so you know, this was not David's idea. This was all Joab. Which, if you're a suspicious person, then you kind of wonder, like, why is the text working so hard to say David had nothing to do with the assassination of Abner? 2 men from Benjamin, we don't know who they are, then assassinate Ishbaal. This is Saul's son, who's the king elsewhere. And they come to David. They bring his head to David. This is beautiful. And then David has them killed as well. Because they did something wrong or because David doesn't want witnesses. Again, the kind of person you are gets revealed as you read this story, and you start to wonder, like, I guess David had nothing to do with it. David just surrounded himself with people like Joab, who seems really, really good at political assassination. Anyway, then David now becomes king of all Israel. Elders come from all across the land to Hebron. They anoint David as king over all of Israel. He's 30 years old, and we're told he rules for 33 more years after that. Many wives, many concubines. He leads a raid against Jerusalem, which is still being held by a group called the Jebusites. This is a group that didn't get wiped out during the conquest that we talked about 3 weeks ago. They take Jerusalem. David takes Jerusalem and makes it his capital. And then as well has victory over Philistines as well. We keep going. David decides to bring the Ark to Jerusalem. Remember the Ark of the Covenant? Margaret talked about that last week. The Ark of the Covenant has just been hanging out, I think, in someone's house for a long time, in a tent, really. And David says, we should bring that to Jerusalem. We're going to talk about this more later on. But basically making Jerusalem now not just the political center or capital of all of Israel, but the religious or the cultic center of it as well. This is David dancing before the Ark, and that's one of his wives, Michal, seeing him out the window. Come back to that in a minute. God then speaks through the prophet to David. This is one of the places where God speaks and makes a covenant about David's descendants. I'll come back to this as well. Let me say one more thing about the Ark. The great thing about the Ark is they're bringing it to Jerusalem, and it's being pulled on a cart led by oxen. And the oxen get wobbly, and it looks like the ark's about to fall off, and a man named Uzzah puts his hand out to steady it, and God strikes him dead because he's touched the ark. So David abandons his plan to bring the ark to Jerusalem, and he gives the ark to a man named Obed-Edom, who keeps the ark for 3 months, because David is terrified of the ark after this. So we don't know who Obed-Edom is, but it's his job to basically keep the ark like in his living room or something like that. And the text says, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his household. And as a result, David's no longer afraid, and then David brings the ark to Jerusalem. So Obed-Edom's kind of like the canary in the coal mine here, right? Like, tell us if it's safe to live with this thing. And David brings the ark to Jerusalem. And we'll come back to this story, but it's funny. It's horrible if you're Uzzah and Uzzah's family. But anyway, where are we? It's about power, right? What kind of power can David access, and how will he do it? And is it good that he does it, or is it not? 3 chapters of military victories. Let's just skip those. David sins against Bathsheba and her husband Uriah. We'll get to this. We'll come back to this for sure. Nathan's parable and pronouncement. Nathan basically says, everybody knows what you've done, David, and God knows what you've done, and then announces what's going to happen as a result. We'll get to that. 2 Samuel. The pattern recurs. If you don't know what the pattern is, David takes Bathsheba. She gets pregnant as a result. He kills her husband Uriah. And the same pattern recurs in David's own household. Ammon, one of his sons, his firstborn son, rapes his half-sister Tamar. So half-sister, David is father of both Ammon and Tamar, different mothers. Absalom is Tamar's full brother. They're full siblings, same mother, same father. Absalom's aware of what's happened, and David refuses to punish Ammon as a result. And Absalom sits with this for 2 full years, and then when he has an opportunity, he instructs his servants to kill his half-brother Ammon as what's the word I want? Retribution for the rape of Tamar. Absalom runs away and stays away for 3 years, and then Joab convinces David to let Absalom return to Jerusalem. Absalom comes back to Jerusalem, and after 2 years without seeing his father, finally David forgives him, or David kisses Absalom as this kind of symbol of forgiveness. David's grieving is over. So this is 3 years after the murder of Ammon, 5 years after the rape of Tamar. So I say the pattern recurs, right? It's this pattern of rape. It's a pattern of then death, and a pattern of kind of forgiveness. As God forgives David, or David seeks forgiveness, so Absalom seeks forgiveness from David. So we get a sense of the same kinds of stories repeating now within David's own family. Absalom sticks around for 4 years and has subtle influence. He finds people who are coming to Jerusalem and are seeking some kind of legal resolution. And Absalom basically says, well, if I were king, this is what I would do. And he's always kind of ruling in favor of people. And so Absalom's fame grows. We're told he's one of the most beautiful people in the entire land. We're told he's got amazing hair. Like every time he cuts his hair once a year, and it tells us how much his hair weighs and all of this. He's just this charming figure. And Absalom grows more and more popular in Israel, and so he finally rebels and takes Jerusalem. He forces David to flee from the city because David has lost popular support, and he leaves 10 of his concubines behind in the city to kind of tend for his residence. Absalom comes into Jerusalem. There are a variety of alliances gained and lost. We've got this, the civil war has broken out. And Absalom is in Jerusalem, and there's a story where he pitches a tent on the roof of David's palace, the same place where David appears to have been when he sees Bathsheba, way back in chapter 11, which again we'll get to. Ammon pitches a tent up there and takes David's 10 remaining concubines and has his way with them in this tent so the entire city can watch, so to speak. It's just, like I said, a gross story in a number of ways. This is Absalom's way of saying, I'm king now and nobody can stop me. When David comes back into Jerusalem, he wins the civil war. When David comes back into Jerusalem, he ends up imprisoning these 10 women for the rest of their lives, probably enslaved women. Like I said, there's just a lot of victims in 2 Samuel who show up. So just to note that there's a whole chapter about strategizing, and finally what everybody's waiting for is the defeat of Absalom. David's armies battle Absalom's armies. And before they do so, David tells his people to deal gently with my son Absalom, is what he says. David still loves him. Deal gently with Absalom. And what we're told is Absalom is riding, and he's riding his mule, and the mule goes under an oak tree, and Absalom gets stuck in the oak tree. And we're not sure how he gets his head stuck, but traditionally the rabbis have thought it's his hair. It's his beautiful, long, flowing hair that gets stuck in the oak tree. And there's this interesting line. The Bible says that he was left there hanging between heaven and earth. We get this idea of Absalom in this kind of, like a threshold. We've been talking about thresholds this month, right? Absalom is both this awful insurrectionist or revolutionary, and he's also David's son. And then David had said, deal gently with my son Absalom. Soldiers find him and they leave him there because they didn't think they're supposed to kill him. Joab says, enough of this, and runs 3 spears through Absalom and kills him. Messengers then come to David, and here's a famous line. David says, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." So David wins the civil war but loses his son in the process, and then grieves over this, and grieves greatly, so much so that in chapter 19, Joab says to him, would you stop whining like you won the war? And Joab says, the way you're crying over your lost son is actually disrespect to me and to the rest of your military. It's almost as if you wish we had died and your son had lived. So Joab is dismissed from his post as David's military leader. And David replaces Joab with Amasa, who's one of his nephews. And Amasa is the man who Absalom had appointed his military captain. And David's like, I'm going to take the guy who led the armies of the revolt, and I'm going to make him now my captain. So David appoints him and reassures him, like, we're flesh and blood. Nothing's going to go wrong with you. Don't worry about it. And then in chapter 20, Joab kills Amasa. And David will eventually reappoint Joab back to the position. So Amasa's, brought back in, it's okay. There's also a line where David says, are there any other descendants of Saul that we can do good things for? Like, all of Saul's sons have died, right? They're all dead, right? And like, oh no, there is still one heir. There is still one male offspring of Saul who's still out there. And David's like, we should invite him to live here in my castle with me. So again, you see kind of like, is David doing good, by Saul's memory? Or is David just basically imprisoned the man who might be able to make a claim to be Saul's heir, right? The way in which David is, and Joab especially, always lurking in the shadows, is working really hard to make sure that there's nobody who will challenge David. Joab also quashes another revolt. This is a more small-scale one, and that's also when David reinstates him. There are more battles, of course, in chapter 21. In chapter 22, David offers a long psalm of thanks to God, sings a song of thanks to God, which is almost the same as Psalm 18. Which is just interesting, kind of a way in which the Bible is kind of speaking to itself, or there's resonances in the Bible. David offers gratitude to God toward the end of his life. And then in chapter 24, he takes a census, which angers God. Why do you take a census? To tax people, exactly, right? So one of David's last acts as king is to take a census. Not the only reason. We take censuses now for, I think, other reasons, sometimes to help erase inequities. But in this case, right, this is about taxation and also conscription, like into the military, right? I need to know where all the strong young men are living, and so when I need them for my battles, I can get them. That's where 2 Samuel ends. David will die next week in chapter 2 of 1 Kings. But on his deathbed, he will tell his son Solomon about some of his closest allies, including Joab, who might be trouble, and maybe it'd be a shame if something happened to Joab as well. So that's the story. It's a story really of some bare-knuckle politics and military action. I had asterisks by a few of those, and I want to go back to a couple of these stories just to get a little bit more richness. In other words, say, don't trust me for summarizing the story. Read some of this for yourself. David and the ark in 2 Samuel 6. This is when they've taken it out of the house of the man whose family was blessed by it. Those who bore the ark, they're going to finally take it to Jerusalem. Those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, and then David sacrificed an ox and a fatted calf. In other words, every time the ox took 6 steps, they would pause and do a sacrifice. This is kind of the kind of ritual that's around this. They all recognize how powerful the ark is because it represents the presence of God, or maybe it even is the presence of God. They get to Jerusalem. David danced before the Lord with all his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. Everyone wants to know what that is. I heard a sermon once that said, we don't know, but we can be sure it was skimpy, was the actual line in the sermon. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting, with the shout of a trumpet. It's this massive display, and David is leading it. He's a man after God's own heart, right? He's thrilled the temple that this has come into the ark has come into the city. As the ark of the Lord came into the city, Michal, daughter of Saul, this is one of David's wives, one of Saul's daughters, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. I'll skip this paragraph. They bring the ark in. David had to set up a tent for it, and they have offerings. David gives food to everybody, including a cake of raisins, which I would really not appreciate. So if you're thinking about what to get me for my birthday, a cake of raisins is not it. But back then it was a big deal. Just raisins. David returned to bless his household. He goes home after his day of dancing and sacrificing and feasting. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today. This is utter sarcasm. Uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me in place of your father and all his household to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. I will dance before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be humbled in my own eyes. But the maids of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. In other words, I can debase myself all I want, and the people are always going to love me. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Why include that? In some ways, it might underline the spite between these two. Why would David want to marry the daughter of Saul? Political convenience, right? And also, it's a way of saying, don't worry, none of David's children had Saul's blood in them, right? All this way of trying to paint a real different path for David than Saul. You could read this of David saying, I love God so much it just doesn't matter. You could also read this as David saying, you have no idea who I am, right? You have no idea how popular I am among these people. Anyway, God's covenant. Very next chapter. So David has now basically made Jerusalem the religious capital and the political capital. Very powerful move on his part. Does he do it out of a pure heart, or does he do it because he's a calculating and ruthless ruler? You decide. God then speaks to David in 2 Samuel 7. And what happens is David tells the prophet Nathan, it's not fair that I have this really fancy palace and the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. I'm going to build a temple for God. And Nathan says, go do it. That's a great idea. And then God says to Nathan, you need to go back to David and say no. And so God says this to Nathan, go tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I haven't lived in a house since the day I brought the people up from Israel. This is basically God saying, I've never complained. I like living in tents. I've never asked for a house. What is this? This is God's martyr complex, I think, coming out here in the way this is described. I'm going to get struck down before the end of this hour. I never commanded. Why have you not built me a house of cedar? I'm skipping down. Therefore, you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have went and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. In other words, God's saying, I chose you. Don't worry about this. This is after Abner, but this is still before Bathsheba. So God's saying, this is all that I've done for you, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel. I will plant them. I'm skipping down. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. So I've underlined that word house in here. It shows up 5 times, and it's being used in 2 ways. It's being used to describe a temple, David wants to build a house, a temple for God, and God says, I'm going to build you a house. In other words, I'm going to build you a dynasty. Right? I'm going to build you a lineage, is God's promise to David. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, when you die, I will raise up offspring after you who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. This is probably talking about Solomon, David's son who becomes king, who actually builds a temple. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. Now it seems to be talking more about just his lineage in general, that there will always be a king with David's blood, so to speak, and always be a descendant of David. And then further down, your house, right, your dynasty and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This has been taken by interpreters as a prophecy of the king always being a Davidic king, always being a king in the line of David. We've got some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the 1940s from a Jewish sect describe this passage and talk about hope of a Davidic ruler, of a coming figure from the line of David. There are other Jewish texts that talk about a descendant of David who will purify the land, who will make Israel free again, who will make Israel its own nation again. This is coming out through... it's where Jews celebrate Hanukkah around the revolt against a group called the Seleucids. This is when they're under Greek rule. And anyway, the point is we've got Jewish texts that are hoping for a revival of the Davidic kingdom, and they're drawing from 2 Samuel chapter 7. Advent is coming. We will see passages like this. This is where in Luke chapter 1, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and describes the boy that's going to be born to her as one who will be great, will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. Mary in the Magnificat also sings about David and the lineage of David. We'll see this in some of the prophetic stories we're going to look at in the weeks to come. Both of the genealogies of Jesus, both in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel, stress that he's a descendant, or at least that Joseph is a descendant of David, right? So genealogy is very important, right, for establishing this kingly, credential for Jesus. What's one of the terms that gets used for Jesus in Christian art and hymnody? He's the Lion of Judah. What's Judah? That's David's tribe. That's where he was declared king. So 2 Samuel's got a long tail, so to speak, right, that carries on in Jewish hopes about a restored monarchy, which then, as Christianity arises out of Judaism, becomes a way of talking about Jesus. Not necessarily David's ruthlessness, but this idea of God having pledged this everlasting kingdom to David. All right, we've got to talk about this story. It's 10 o'clock. I can do this. Just because the story deserves, several hours on its own to kind of interrogate what's going on in the story. I want to start with the image here, which is both funny and gross at the same time, right? The story begins saying where David goes up and he's walking on the roof of his palace and he sees a woman named Bathsheba who is bathing. He can see that from his roof, and we're told the woman was very beautiful. So first of all, the proximity to where Bathsheba is and David in this image is kind of hilarious, right? And everybody's just kind of like staring down. And the fact that Bathsheba is just getting her feet washed is kind of funny. I put this up here because it is incredibly difficult to find art that doesn't show Bathsheba naked in some way, shape, or form. Right? So much art, right? Good, holy Christian art, right? That's meant to tell the story. Just plays to the male gaze in talking about Bathsheba, right? That here she is out bathing. Who could have resisted somebody this beautiful is the implication of a lot of that art. I mentioned at the beginning, we've found ways, we being men, have to whitewash this story, to make it like, of course David couldn't have resisted. Who could have resisted somebody so beautiful? Or what was she doing out there bathing in full view of the entire city like that, right? Somehow shaming her, it's Bathsheba's fault. It gets reiterated in so many ways in art related to this passage, and in sermons sometimes related to this passage. None that I've heard here, but you hear that over and over again, right? How can we blame Bathsheba? Bathsheba is mostly silent throughout the book of 2 Samuel, But at the beginning of Kings, when David is dying, she makes sure that it's her son Solomon who becomes king. In other words, she becomes kind of the kingmaker there. So that has led some to suggest that Bathsheba is conniving, right? That Bathsheba has set this whole thing up so that she might gain power in David's kingdom. The story as 2 Samuel presents it, I think, says no such thing. So here's the story. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, right? They don't fight year-round in the ancient world, but when the kings go out to battle, you would expect David, the king, to be out there fighting. But no, David sent Joab, his commander, and his officers, and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. So David has now become either too powerful or too old or too whatever. He's not going to go out with his armies anymore. He's going to stay at Jerusalem while men fight on his behalf. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. This is all we're told to describe, to characterize Bathsheba in the text. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, "This is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." So Uriah is not an Israelite, technically speaking, but as with many people in 2 Samuel, he's fighting on behalf of David. So David sent his messengers to get her. And that verb "get" there is the same verb that's used in the passage in 1 Samuel that Margaret read last week, where Samuel says to the people, "Are you sure you want a king? A king's going to take. He's going to take your best animals. He's going to take your land. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your sons." It's the same word that's used there. He sent messengers to take her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now, she was purifying herself after her period. Why in the world would the author put that in there? Well, who knows? It's a short answer. The longer answer is this would remove any doubt that Uriah could have been the father to a child, right? He's off fighting a battle. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David. These are the only words she's allowed to say in the story, the only words the narrator gives her. "I am pregnant," which is what turns David's world upside down, so to speak. David doesn't ponder this immediately. I didn't put this on a slide. The very next verse, he calls Joab and he says, "Where's Uriah?" Like, where's her husband? He's out there fighting. David says, "Bring him back home. I want him to come back home, have a little shore leave or have a respite." Uriah comes home and he sets up and sleeps outside of his house. He refuses to go into his house. And David finds him the next day and is like, "Why don't you go into your house? You should go into your house. Have a good time with your wife." And he's like, "My men are out there fighting in the trenches. Far be it for me to come out here while they're out there fighting, bleeding, and dying, for me to have pleasure and spend time with my wife." So David gets him drunk, sends him back home. Uriah sleeps on the doorstep again, refuses to go into his house. So David gets furious, sends him back out with the armies, and tells Joab, "I want you to send Uriah and his people to the front. And when the fighting gets fierce, have everybody else draw back so Uriah is killed," which is exactly what happens. So Joab orchestrates this murder of Uriah on David's behalf. When the time for grieving is done, it says David takes Bathsheba into his own house, and she became his wife. The point is, there's no agency here for Bathsheba in the way the story is told, right? This is a rape of Bathsheba, I think, is the best way of titling what's going on here, and the murder of Uriah. So this is David now kind of falling victim to the worst of the trappings of the power that he's kind of delightfully claimed for himself. As a result, Uriah dies. Bathsheba is now one of his many wives. This then triggers the arrival of Nathan the prophet. Nathan first tells a story to David. He's like, there was a rich man who had all of these flocks, was very wealthy, and there was a poor man who had just one baby ewe that he loved and he nursed and he brought it up into its fullness. And then visitors came to the rich man. The rich man didn't want to kill any of his flocks, so he stole the sheep from the poor man and killed it. And David doesn't think this is a parable. He thinks this is a legal judgment. He said, "Well, that man should die." And Nathan says, "Well, you're the man." All right, this is Nathan speaking truth to power. Nathan says, "You are the man." Now Nathan speaks for God. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom." This is how men talk. I was going to say in the ancient world, this is how men talk. This idea of Saul's wives being now trophies for David. Right? I mean, this is all the patriarchy of the ancient world is summed up in this story, or a lot of the patriarchy is. If that had been too little, I would have added as much more. In other words, if you weren't satisfied, David, I would have given you even more, right? God is, I've given, I've given, I've given. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in God's sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You have taken his wife to be your wife. There's that word take again. And have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites, right? You use the foreigners, the Ammonites, to kill Uriah. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house. This is that line, right? Violence is going to stalk you and stalk your family. For you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. So here's the prediction, so to speak, of the rape of Tamar, the rebellion of Absalom. And I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. Again, now you've got images of how best to shame David. Well, to take women from him. I mean, the ways in which women are commodities in this story. This is probably a prediction of what Absalom does with David's concubines on the roof of the palace. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. In other words, you thought you could take Uriah as your own and kill her husband without getting caught. God says, I'm going to make this so obvious, right, about how much you're going to suffer. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. This is David's contrition or confession. Psalm 51 is also kind of cast as this elongated confession. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die. This is where we go back to that question of punishment, consequences, like what's going on here? How many innocent people suffer and die because of David and David's choices? And what is God's role in all of this? Some people read this and say, wow, well, God's a forgiver. That's absolutely true, but also there are consequences to what happens to David and to the people around him. David and Bathsheba will have another child named Solomon. Solomon actually in Hebrew means his replacement, which is not what I'd want to be named, but probably a reference to the child who's lost after childbirth, to Bathsheba, but probably also a reference to this idea that he's going to replace David as king. Those are the stories I wanted to highlight, which, like I said before, all are uncomfortable stories in their own way, not just because of David and his ruthlessness and his flaws, but because of where is God in this story, right? Is there hope for anybody in this story? What about the innocents in a story like this? So where I want to leave us, and left hopefully a little time, is this. Do you think David's story can be a story about a deeply flawed ruler and at the same time a story about God's faithfulness? Is it just one or the other? Is it neither of those things? Is it both? What does the story read like based on what I've told you or what you might have read? Or we could ask this question, or maybe we could ask this question. What does this story tell us about God? How does the ways that David is presented matter for what this story means? In other words, you might say this is not a story about God. This is kind of a look what happens to David story. Is it kind of a morality tale, a warning story? Is it just an ugly story? Is it a story where we're supposed to somehow think how wonderful for David to be able to still survive in a world like this? I think today, instead of doing small groups, I don't want to put anybody on the spot with the subject matter, to be honest, but maybe people want to weigh in on one or either of these questions, or maybe just have comments about what we've talked about or questions about what we've talked about. There's a microphone somewhere in the room. Tim's got a microphone, which is useful, at least while we still have the live streamers here for a couple more moments. Thanks.
When were these books written, and in what setting?
Certainly there are traditions here that are probably very old. David's around the year 1000 BCE. The stories come together, they get written down and kind of formalized and quote-unquote fixed in terms of set as texts around the return from the exile from Babylon, so around the early 6th century. So 350, 400 years later is around the time. And as we've been talking about, that period is a time where Judah, first Israel and then Judah, they become two nations, has been utterly humiliated politically, socially, and militarily, religiously, and is now in the process of just trying to reestablish a nation, a capital, a temple. So in some ways, it's a bit of a longing for the quote-unquote good old days. And by good old days, David kept the nation secure. The boundaries were relatively secure at that time. But it's also a reminder that the good old days were Davidic days. And for David to keep the nation safe, he had to, or maybe this is not true, I didn't phrase that right. David's way of keeping the nation safe was at a high moral cost. So maybe it's a cautionary tale. Does that help kind of get the timing? I wish we had editors who said the reason we wrote this story down was because X, Y, Z, but we don't have that. Betty.
I guess my question back to you is, as we listen to the story of Samuel about David, why should we care? You know, I mean, I found myself more and more and more agitated during this story. And you are a great biblical scholar. And you do such a fabulous job of making this story entertaining and really taking us through it. But my goodness, to have these stories where women are just such fodder and just thrown away and used and raped and everything, why should we care? The only thing that I can relate to here is what has changed today when we still have the same warring going on in the same place, in the same part of the world, and that who are the fodder? It's women and children. That's the only way I can take anything away from this. I don't really feel God's presence in this story.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, Betty. I mean, but I agree. The why should we care is a great question. The good, the bad, the uncanny, I'd say this is largely in the bad category, you know, to go back to that. Why are we spending an hour on it? Because it's in the Bible and we're trying not to duck the hard stories. But it is a question of, is there any good news in this, or is this just a story about, I have a friend who's an Old Testament scholar who likes to say, this is why we need Jesus. In other words, what he means by that is not a kind of an anti-Jewish slight, but it's about the depths of human sin. Do we need one more story about the depths of human sin when we live it every day? I would say maybe not.
There's the question, and really, you know, as I look at it, it's a story by men, for men, and about men. Yes. And you come back to today, and today in America, less than 1% of rapes will ever end up being adjudicated, will ever end up with a person in prison. Yeah. And so, you know, the more things change, the more things stay the same.
Right. Yeah, all I can say is I agree, and thank you.